Digital Dollar Project. Tell us, what is the Digital Dollar Project?
Yeah, no, it's good. So, great to join all of you. The Digital Dollar Project is a not-for-profit effort
Do you remember all the charitable things Ripple has done?
that we launched earlier this year. I did that in partnership with former CFTC Chairman Chris Giancarlo.
Chris Giancarlo has publicly stated that XRP is not a security.
His brother, Charlie Giancarlo, who's an executive at a tech firm out in the Bay Area. And then David Treat, who's a managing director at Accenture.
Accenture has worked with and invested in Ripple since the very beginning.
Is one of our partners in the Digital Dollar Project. We can go into a little bit more of the background of the DDP, but at its core, it's a not-for-profit effort focused on exploring tokenization of the US dollar at the government or federal reserve level. So essentially trying to understand and advocate for the potential benefits of tokenization of the US dollar.
This also adds to my theory of XRP escrow gifted to the Fed.
So as you mentioned, we launched earlier this year, and just a few weeks ago put out a white paper that goes into a little bit more detail of what a so-called champion model would be for a tokenized US dollar.
This excerpt was taken directly from the Digital Dollar white paper. Our champion model intends to explore distributed ledger technology with public, private, and perhaps novel public-private organizations validating transactions. Through careful deliberation, the project will develop a framework for the validation and governance of the new network. The project's approach is inspired by the creation of the Internet, which was developed through a model of public-private partners.
And so what was sort of the impetus? When did these conversations start among the co-founders and sort of the people in your network? What was the real impetus for starting this project?
So you mentioned I was previously at the CFTC, where I was the director of Lab CFTC, their Financial Technology and Innovation Office. And over the years have spent a lot of time meeting with and learning about various types of crypto, blockchain, tokenization type firms and concepts. And I think, one of the things that stood out to me, which will be no surprise to anybody on this joining this meeting, is that, you can send information via an email halfway around the world with very few intermediaries at very low cost. And what I think tokenization, blockchain, crypto, a lot of what this represents is the idea that you can send information about value and unique ownership of value halfway around the world with relatively little friction, fewer intermediaries, and at lower cost.
He literally just used the same speech as Brad Garlinghouse.
And that's pretty profound. I mean, that's going to eventually impact, I think, the way we transact all types of financial assets and instruments, including money and including fiat money. So, Chris Giancarlo, as many of you have heard from previously, very like-minded and certainly has been one talking about the need for the United States in particular to upgrade some of our financial infrastructure. So having left the CFTC, Chris and I are good friends and stayed in touch and talked about these types of issues. And, last fall, one of the observations we had is that there didn't seem to yet be kind of a national policy around exploration of how tokenization could impact the US dollar itself. So Chris and I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last fall, and you can consider that a bit of a call to action.
Chris Larson and Corey Johnson have been voicing their opinions about the United States in this same very topic.
We got a lot of really incredible inbound and people interested in the topic, wanting to know what we were going to do next. This included some of the folks from the Accenture team. I mentioned David Treat, who are also very like-minded. And so one of the things we thought we needed to do after issuing the call to action was think about how can you actually catalyze action? How do you bring together all of the necessary stakeholders and perspectives to have the conversation about what it would mean and what the implications are of tokenizing the US dollar, how that ripples through a national economy, the global economy.
The word ripple was intentionally used. If the eyes are the window to the soul, then words are the gateway to the mind. Word represents thoughts.
And so that's a difficult topic to work through, but we thought we might be able to create the right platform for doing that. So that's what drove the launch of the Digital Dollar Project early this year. And as I said, the white paper outlines at least our current thinking on the topic, and also outlines kind of a set of expectations of what would be next, which would largely be pilots, real world trials, so that we can measure the purported benefits of tokenization, as well as some of the challenges in actually implementing that.
So Dan, what you're talking about, I think, is what we call in the industry a centralized, a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. Is that essentially what the digital dollar project is aiming at?
Yeah, so it is focused exactly right on central bank digital currency, CBDC. I mean, it might make sense for me to just outline a few key attributes because, again, this is a very broad topic. And when you say CBDC, there's a lot of mixed perceptions and ideas out there as to what that would mean in terms of design. Of course, there are a lot of design choices. There are a lot of trade-offs with certain costs or characteristics. But when we talk about CBDC from a digital dollar project perspective, we have a champion model, one that we would like to test against other, designs and other types of payment mechanisms.
The champion model operates alongside existing monies. It's also going to be working with the existing two-tier architecture of commercial banks and regulated money transfer networks.
So the first and I think really important element here is that when we say CBDC, we're talking about actual tokenization of the dollar as opposed to an accounts-based system. There have been some congressional proposals around Fed accounts, the idea that the Fed could go directly to retail. They may do that through kind of the current account reconciliation process. That's not what we're suggesting as the champion model. Instead, we're suggesting actual tokenized central bank liabilities. So the same way you can hold physical cash, which is backed by the full faith and credit and issued by the government, this would be a tokenized dollar with the exact same kind of attributes. The other key characteristic is that we believe this should be issued through the existing two-tier banking system, meaning that existing banks and other types of regulated money transmitters, so that would include all of those from the world of fintech and the types of licensing and regulation that they are subject to, would be the kind of primary distributors. So it would not be direct central bank to retail, which we don't think would be a wise design choice, instead largely through the existing two-tiered structure. We can get into this a little bit more as well. I mean, our champion model presumes that the actual rails would be DLT or blockchain based. Of course, there's a lot of really thorny questions about how you operationalize that, who serves as validators, but we think that there are privacy and resiliency benefits from that type of structure. And the last thing I would point out, and especially relevant to the discussion today, our champion model is not in any way antithetical to private sector innovation and a lot of the developments around stablecoins and other crypto assets. In fact, to be totally blunt, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, but for Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin is the reason that people started thinking about, systems, friction, automation, interoperability of networks, and all of the things that are kind of driving the back end of how money moves.
This is the same thing Ripple is trying to accomplish.
So we view a lot of the private sector innovation to be incredibly relevant and actually to help inform what would be a public sector driven initiative like a tokenized CBDC.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You made 3 points there that I want to dig into a little bit more. First, I want to sort of just ask you how far you are along in this project, and maybe also note for the audience that Digital Dollar Project has published a white paper. I think it's worth reading. There's obviously significant thought that has gone into it.
You better say that.
Go ahead and check it out. Google it and download it if you haven't already. But Dan, I mean, when you think of the horizon here of where you guys are going, how far in are you? Are you just in ideation stage?
It's a great question. Look, it's a massively complicated subject. And, one thing during the crisis, there was a lot of concern about how funds were being distributed and people started thinking about, well, could a CBDC be helpful? And that it's the right set of questions to be asking, but this is not something that you can implement overnight. I mean, we're talking about the US dollar. It is the reserve currency, or at least the current choice global reserve currency. And there's a lot that you need to make sure you do right. So our view is that it is absolutely the right time to be exploring and pursuing a CBDC, but it needs to be done really thoughtfully. And so as a result of that, where we are in the project is that we published, as you said, the white paper. It is quite detailed, at least in our current thinking. Now, there are a lot of questions and a lot of open questions. Solving for the balance between proper law enforcement needs and privacy is a critical one. Talking about the rails and the governance of the payment system is a critical one. Understanding whether the purported benefits are there in different types of applications like retail, or domestic payments usage, wholesale, international applications. all of these things need to actually be tested out. So in terms of what this likely looks like, we wanted to kind of have this round of discussion around the white paper. From there, what we would suggest is that there be real world pilots and trials so that you actually can measure. I mean, we can talk a lot about this, but until you start testing this in the wild, it's very difficult to really measure the outcomes. Obviously, there are some global central banks that are probably a bit further along in that real world piloting or testing phase. So we think that that's really, really important. But look, realistically,
we're working with any of those. Sorry to interrupt. Are you working with any of those players? Are you getting feedback on those experiments?
I'll say that one of the real benefits of partnering with Accenture is that blockchain team is working with a lot of the global central bank projects.
Accenture and the bridge asset. Accenture working with a lot of the global projects.
So there's a good wealth of expertise there. We also have had the opportunity to speak with many of the other central banks that are working on these projects to learn from them, hear from them. I also think keeping that line of communication is critical because interoperability is going to be a critical piece of an ultimate design. You certainly don't want to start creating like these siloed CBDC projects that don't really make sense for a global economy, especially US dollar leadership in a global economy. So all of that is really important. Look, the time is right now to do this. In our original op-ed, Chris and I referred to this as kind of the space race, or the desire to put a man on the moon from many decades ago. And it took over 10 years for that to happen. In the process, it spawned incredible technological innovation and development to get to that endpoint. And there's a lot of design and thinking design choices and thinking that goes into a successful project like that. And we view this as very similar. It's going to require kind of obviously public sector leadership. At the end of the day, we cannot tokenize the US dollar. I mean, that will be the Federal Reserve in conjunction probably with other regulators in Congress that would have to make that decision. But the private sector, the way we do things in the US typically is through kind of strong private sector leadership.
This decision is a political decision. Stewart XRP is a valuable member of the XRP community.
Can you envision a scenario if this country ever goes back to gold standard? If this country ever goes back,
there's something very nice about having something solid. We used to have a very solid. We used to have a very solid based on a gold standard. We don't have that. It was based on a gold standard. There is something very nice about the. There is something very nice about the concept of that. It would be very hard to do at this point. And one of the problems is we don't have the gold. Other places have the gold.
And that's the same kind of model we think we should be applying here.
And now it's stupid question time. So what problem does this really solve? If you had to just boil it down to one or 2 points, what's the real pain point or the real problem that this solves?
This goes back to, I think it's not a rocket science observation, but it's the view that if you were to design systems today to move value and information about value and ownership, would you use the same systems that we designed 30 years ago? And the answer is no.
SWIFT is an antique. The whole world knows it.
Because they're going to be legacy systems, often siloed, with many intermediaries and manual processes that are not the most efficient. So if you start with the idea that computers connect and we should be able to move information about value in a very efficient way with fewer intermediaries, then the potential ripple through of the entire global economy of that profound point.
He said it again, ripple.
I think is substantial. So where does it help? It again, I would boil it down to like 3 broad categories. There's the retail component of this. May this impact individuals seeking to make purchases with a different payment option, maybe merchants and vendors who want to receive a competitive source of payment, perhaps. There's maybe an access and inclusion aspect here, where if the technology and operational costs are lower of this system and digital wallet service providers are able from a tech, operational, and regulatory perspective offer a lower cost service than say traditional bank accounts, you should have kind of more ubiquitous access to that type of a wallet service. So perhaps we can pull certain percentages of or underbanked populations in. That's just the retail side. You've got wholesale payments in markets and the idea that you would have far more efficient financial transactions if you were able to do this with tokenized money. So there's tremendous benefit there. And then of course, at the end of the day, I mean, this is central bank backed money. It is the most risk-free fiat currency in the world. So there you could see a lot of kind of international use as well. Then you've got the international kind of remittance aspect of it, which is also a promising channel. And look, at the end of the day, this is again, the idea that when it's very hard to predict exactly how this flows through a very dynamic global economy. So I assume there are going to be many benefits that we're not even contemplating right now. I know we haven't gone into like the programmability aspect of money, but I think that's another really important aspect.
We've only just scratched the surface. And
yeah, we have a couple questions that have come through the Q&A. Dan, to focus on some of the regulatory aspects and the policy aspects of this.
Sure.
You mentioned that the digital dollar project cannot be the entity that tokenizes the US dollar. The government ultimately has to do this. There seems to have been a bit of a shift in the tone from Fed, Treasury, Congress on the topic of a digital dollar since we've entered into this global health pandemic and economic crisis. Can you just talk about how conversations have changed over the past several months regarding the digital dollar?
Dollars can be programmed. Conditional money that expires.
And the different government entities that you guys are engaging with?
Yeah, I mean, the tone has shifted, as exactly right. And I think, look, I think that the crisis underscored areas of weakness in a lot of digital infrastructure. I think digital identity is actually a really big piece of this as well. But leaving that aside, I do think that a lot
Does this have to do with digital identity?
of things have changed. I'm even going to go back to before the pandemic. I mean, you obviously have developments like the Libra project. You've had more announcements coming out about the digital yuan project. That was at the latter half of last year that there was even more attention focused there. All of these developments, I think have gained kind of broader attention from traditional banking sectors, from policymakers, and from Washington in particular. I think the tone of what you've heard has shifted over time as a result of that. I think there are a lot of really good efforts happening in the US. I mean, whether it's organizations like yours, Perianne, certainly our hope of catalyzing further action through the Digital Dollar Project, and a lot of academic efforts. You've seen global papers coming out from Bank of England, BIS, IMF. I mean, a lot of thinking going on, and I do think that's gotten people's attention. So what I think is promising is that regardless of the political spectrum, I think a lot of people in Washington see potential benefit through a lot of different lenses. I mean, you can talk about access inclusion, you can talk about the economic role of the US dollar globally. All of these things resonate. So there has been a shift. You know, I do think government moves slowly, and the Fed is going to be very cautious, and rightfully so.
Is this the reason Ripple is making a lot of noise about China?
I think what we'd like to see is safe spaces created so that testing and piloting is possible. So I think that that's what I'd hope to see come out of this period. And I would assume that policymakers will increasingly say, even if you're a skeptic, why wouldn't you? Isn't it prudent? Isn't it practical to plan for the possibility that there are real benefits?
He's talking about a regulatory sandbox
here. And if you're going to do that, you can't just flip a switch 5 years from now and start issuing a tokenized US dollar. There's a lot of back work that would have to happen. So now is that time.
Yeah, we've got time for about one more question, just to shift gears here on a topic I know a lot of chamber members, we've had a lot of conversations at the chamber on, but you guys have some very interesting approaches to the privacy design around central bank digital currency. How are you guys approaching privacy from the aspect of a digital dollar?
So privacy is one of those like key categories that's like its own specific work stream. You know, look, I would say how we're approaching it is with a clear understanding that privacy is one of the things that could give a US dollar, a tokenized US dollar, a certain competitive advantage relative to perhaps other global designs. And privacy is important, and expectations around privacy are very important. So we take that very seriously. At the same time, there are going to be appropriate regulatory and law enforcement needs where you do need to satisfy, you know, the existing BSA AML regime. How you balance that, I think the best starting point is to hold the analogy with physical cash. I mean, clearly our system recognizes distinctions between smaller size transactions versus larger size transactions. And I think that's a good starting point. There have been a lot of central banks that have thought about it in that same way. So I you know, that's an area where I think design, it's a policy choice at the end of the day, but starting to think about whether smaller transactions may err on the privacy side of the spectrum seems to make good sense. And it's probably most consistent with how people would expect, you know, a US CBDC to be designed.
Dan, I realize we're going to need about 4 hours for our next session. So thanks for committing to that. We appreciate it. And
no, I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to hearing the next presentations. And, you know, if I can leave with one final point, you know, the more I've been thinking about the tokenized US dollars, you can think about it almost like a public highway, right? Like the interstate system was created. It impacted certain types of transport businesses, but also created new transport businesses and unleashed a lot of economic activity. I think it's the same thing with tokenized CBDC. I think that the amount of private sector innovation and development that can be built on top of that, wrapping further programmability around a tokenized dollar is really exciting. So I think that that's kind of a segue into some of the next conversations, but that's an area where I think a lot of creativity can be applied.
Thanks so much.